Let's step right into part 1 of our explainer series, Death in the Hive, Is Bee Honey Biblically Clean? I'm your host, Bill Gramitz. Now, in our last explainer, we laid some vital groundwork. We looked at exactly how the Torah classifies the honeybee within its strict framework of biblical taxonomy. As we saw, under the law given in Leviticus 11, the bee is unequivocally classified as an unclean, swarming, flying insect, what the text calls the shekeretz ha'of. We also established that Scripture doesn't just mention this in passing. It applies escalating legal terms to these non-leaping insects. It uses tameh, meaning unclean, sheketz, meaning detestable, and finally to'eva, which is an abomination. The creature itself is definitively sealed under these biblical classifications.
With that classification firmly set, we find ourselves standing before a deeply profound, immutable principle, beautifully articulated in Job chapter 14. The scripture reads, "Who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean? There is not one." This right here is the foundational biblical dilemma that absolutely must govern our understanding of honey. The principle is clear, and the biological origin is clear. And yet, when we're faced with this definitive biblical verdict, almost all of us instinctively reach for one specific, very human mental justification.
It's a quiet assumption, one that allows bee honey to remain a safe exception in our minds. We like to think of the bee as merely a neutral courier. This is what we might call the neutral vessel fallacy. We tell ourselves that honey just begins as floral nectar, a sweet, pure gift right off a blossom. In our minds, we picture the bee flying to a flower, scooping up raw plant syrup, carrying it in some tiny, sterile container inside its body, and dropping it off in the honeycomb completely untouched and altered. It's a comforting thought. Under that assumption, the sweetness remains entirely from the flower, making it clean by association. Now, that instinct is completely understandable, but when we actually test that assumption against creation itself, the scientific record forces a much more precise accounting.
We have to look past where the sweetness simply begins. We need to examine what it becomes, how it's processed, and what it remains inseparably mixed with by the time it reaches a jar on your kitchen table. When we trace the journey from the flower to the sealed comb step by step, that neutral vessel story entirely collapses. The first step in honey production does indeed start at the blossom, but here's the reality. Nectar collection is immediately and intimately tied to the bee's internal digestive anatomy. The very moment a bee gathers floral nectar, that substance crosses a profound biological boundary.
You see, bees gather this sucrose-rich floral nectar using their proboscis, and they draw it deep inside their bodies, storing it in an organ known as the honey crop. We need to be scientifically precise here. The honey crop is not an external pouch. It's not a saddlebag draped over the bee, and it's certainly not a sterile glass vial. Anatomically speaking, the honey crop is a specialized storage foregut. It is connected directly to the bee's own digestive tract, so that raw nectar is now residing deep inside the internal organs of a living, unclean organism.
Right between this foregut and the rest of the bee's digestive system sits a fascinating biological valve called the Proventriculus. This valve essentially acts as a gatekeeper. It controls whether the nectar remains in the crop for honey processing or whether it passes onward into the midgut to be consumed for the bee's own personal nourishment. To really visualize this anatomical reality, think of the honey crop like a storage tank that's sitting directly in the exact same fuel line as the engine itself. So even at this initial raw nectar stage, the liquid is in no way traveling in a neutral container. It is traveling inside and acting as a part of a living organism's internal anatomy.
And once that nectar enters the honey crop, the biological manufacturing process kicks off instantly. The bee immediately introduces specialized enzymes, which are produced by its own internal glands, to biochemically transform the liquid. Two absolutely key glandular enzymes are secreted directly into the nectar. This triggers a profound structural change, one that will ultimately turn that raw plant syrup into the substance we know as honey.
The first of these is an enzyme called Invertase. Its job is to cleave the complex sucrose molecules found in the floral nectar, breaking them down into simple sugars, specifically glucose and fructose. Now, it is critical to understand that invertase isn't just some neutral processing agent that's somehow separate from the creature's biology. No, it is a literal digestive secretion. In fact, both mammals and insects use this exact same class of enzymes in their digestive systems to break down their food. The bee is actively digesting the nectar to fundamentally change its chemical structure.
At the exact same time, the bee secretes that second enzyme we mentioned, glucose oxidase. This enzyme goes to work converting a portion of that newly formed glucose into gluconic acid and hydrogen peroxide. This specific chemical action is what dramatically drives the pH of the liquid down to a highly acidic range, typically sitting somewhere between 3.2 and 4.5. This severe acidity is actually what gives honey its characteristic antibacterial stability. But I want you to notice what has happened here. From the very moment these glandular enzymes mix with the nectar in the foregut, that liquid is no longer raw plant syrup. It has been fundamentally biochemically remade inside the bee's body using the insect's own digestive secretions.
From there, this biochemical manufacturing process shifts from the internal organs of one individual bee to the collective biological engine of the entire hive. This incredible feat is achieved through a process called Trophallaxis. When a forager bee returns to the hive, it doesn't just pour its liquid from a container into a storage cell like a bucket. Instead, it transfers the liquid to house bees through direct mouth-to-mouth regurgitation. This mouth-to-mouth liquid exchange is repeated over and over and over again across dozens of worker bees as the liquid is continually processed and distributed throughout the hive.
This repeated mouth-to-mouth regurgitation is actually the primary manufacturing process of honey. And Trophallaxis transfers far, far more than just simple sugars. With every single mouth-to-mouth exchange, the bees are permanently working specific biological materials into the fluid. They're distributing additional glandular enzymes, salivary proteins, the natural microbiota of the hive itself, and, crucially, natural antimicrobial peptides. One of the most significant of these is defensin 1, which is a powerful antibiotic peptide secreted directly from the bee's salivary system. So the biochemistry of the hive, the actual bodily fluids and immune proteins of these insects, are worked thoroughly and permanently into the developing fluid.
Following this extensive, colony-wide chain of regurgitation, the final physical processing steps take place. The house bees finally deposit this thoroughly structurally altered regurgitated liquid into the open comb cells. But the work isn't done yet. Thousands of bees then work in total unison, fanning their wings continuously over the open cells. This acts as a massive ventilation system to evaporate the remaining water out of the fluid.
This continuous fanning is astonishingly effective. It reduces the moisture content of the liquid from roughly 80% all the way down to just 17 or 18%. It's a massive act of dehydration driven entirely by the intense physical labor of the colony. At this precise level of dehydration, the liquid is finally considered ripened, and the cell is permanently capped and sealed by the workers. So look at what creation actually testifies. Look closely at the biological reality of the hive. By the time a cell is capped, the original floral nectar has been entirely structurally and chemically altered. Think about its journey. It has been ingested into an internal foregut. It has been broken down by digestive enzymes, it's been regurgitated mouth-to-mouth across thousands of worker bees, and it has been heavily enriched with salivary immune proteins. Therefore, we have to state the central biological and theological thesis of this reality as clearly as possible. Bees are not couriers carrying honey from a field. Bees do not collect honey, they make it.
To summarize the journey of that nectar, what ultimately ends up in a jar on a grocery store shelf has been thoroughly remade by the bodily fluids and organs of an insect. Honey is an engineered, manufactured substance. It is completely reliant on and literally cannot exist without the internal biology and glandular secretions of an unclean creature. The final product you eat is inseparable from the anatomy of the bee itself.
And this brings us right back to corner ourselves with the inescapable theological reality of Job's foundational question. If the creature itself is explicitly labeled detestable under Yahweh's law, and honey is manufactured entirely through its internal organs and salivary secretions, can we truly claim the yield remains clean? We are forced to weigh our own comforting human assumptions against the hard, unavoidable biological facts of the hive, because as the scripture asks, who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean? There is not one.
This unavoidable biological reality brings us to the very next critical layer of this study, because honey doesn't finish its manufacturing process out in the open air. No, it finishes inside a physical container built entirely from the bee's own body, deeply embedded inside a crowded hive where hundreds of bees die every single day. In part 2 of this explainer series, we are going to step into the anatomy of beeswax and propolis to ask a final, rather uncomfortable question. Can human processing and modern filtration ever truly cleanse a source born of insect waste? I look forward to continuing this study with you then.